Good morning. Happy Monday, everyone. Thanks for starting your day and week with me. You know, as a financial markets geek, you and I have spent a little time in previous weeks talking about, previous months really, talking about Beyond Meat. We've talked about Impossible Burger a little bit, but they're privately held, so you can't trade them. But it's all part of a very, very fascinating industry, and one that, even though I personally am not a huge fan of fake meat, maybe they'll make one that's good enough that I'll like it. I don't know. It's not like I got an ethical problem with fake meat. I just haven't enjoyed it all that much. It might change, but boy, if they could change it, and they're sure trying to get to something that people really want to eat, can you imagine the size of that industry? An industry that could make meat without having to kill animals, having to, all the pollution, all that other stuff. Well, joining us to talk about the industry and the growth of this lab-grown meat, basically, Chase Purdy, the author of the new book, $1 Billion Burger, Inside Big Tech's Race for the Future of Food. Chase, good morning. Thanks for being here.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
I remember years ago, my brother, who was vegan, introduced me to tofurkey, and I tried it, and I thought, wow, that's really, really gross. And I'm sure I wasn't the only one, but a lot of people must have, or did think, and do think, still there's an industry here if we can figure out how to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you're not alone in not liking tofurkey. Certainly, doesn't sound very appetizing to me either. But no, the book goes into a different type of, what you called fake meat, cell-cultured meat's the term that I use, and it's way different than anything that you've sort of have available to you right now. You mentioned the Beyond and Impossible Burgers, and certainly those are noble attempts, and they're kind of more advanced versions of, the black bean burgers maybe we grew up with.
Mm-hmm.
But cell-cultured meat's way different, and it's a really old idea born in a prisoner of war camp during World War II, and it's basically, an animal cell. You feed that animal cell by, basically sticking it into a liquid that's filled with, all the nutrients and proteins and things that normally would course through an animal's system, because you think about it, blood goes through an animal's body, it delivers all sorts of nutrients to the cells then can replicate and grow. You're growing these cells into fat tissue and into muscle tissue, and at the end of the process, you together, and on a molecular and a nutritional level, you have what is the same thing as sort of real meat, just produced in a different way.
And so just to be clear, and it's funny that we're talking about this today because I had the Secretary of Agriculture on the show on Friday, and this topic came up a little bit. Are Beyond Meat and Impossible Burger in this category, or are they a different kind of product than what you just described?
Completely different kind of product. I mean, at a fundamental level, Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods burgers are plant-based. They are imitations. They are trying really hard to replicate all the functionality of meat, but they will never be meat. Definitely not on a nutritional level, and they're plant-based. Mm-hmm. This is different. This is mimics meat. It doesn't even mimic it. It is meat on a nutritional and on a very scientific molecular level. So it's a very, very different thing, more complex. And the taste is, I think anyone who tries this will find that the taste is very different too, because it tastes exactly like what you would expect.
So is your expectation that when cell-cultured meat, and by the way, when I said fake meat, I was really more talking about the stuff made out of plants, not cell-cultured meat.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Is your expectation that when cell-cultured meat is done right, that someone could hand me two burgers, one that came from a traditional cow and one that is cell-cultured, and I ate them, that I would not be able to tell the difference?
I would say yes, that is very possible. I think the very first iterations out, I bet you that the cell-cultured product will taste a little bit richer because it is sort of a very pure form of meat. But, I mean, think about it, the meat that we eat it's good, but usually comes seasoned and dressed, and all of this, other stuff is thrown on it, or it's sort of marinated for a long time. This is going to taste exactly the same. I mean, in fact, all the cell-cultured meat that I've actually been, I think the last piece of cell-cultured meat I had may have been a chicken tender, and it was kind of a humbling experience. I didn't really expect it to sort of feel and taste, and, I also ripped it apart to kind of see how it ripped. And, I mean, it was kind of astounding how exactly alike it is. And one thing I think, too, you mentioned talking to the Secretary of Agriculture, is that it's more than just a climate change thing. If I remember correctly, because I cover the meat industry a little bit, is, back in April, I think it was the JBS plant just north of you in Greeley, had to sort of temporarily close down because of COVID-19. Another reason to be kind of thoughtful about this, and one of the things that cell-cultured meat startup CEOs are starting to talk about more, is that, COVID-19 has really kind of exposed the weaknesses in sort of the meat system as we have it set up, especially with a virus that's sort of wreaking havoc on workers and supply chains. The way that this meat is made is sort of a complete reimagining of like a meat system. It doesn't involve sort of working in close quarters or a traditional meat packing plant would look like, and conditions have to be super sterile as well for it to work. So you really kind of would eliminate some of those concerns too.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a good point. My special guest, Chase Purdy, is a journalist, has written at Courts and Politico and lots of newspapers. His new book is $1 Billion Burger: Inside Big Tech's Race for the Future of Food. So who's doing this right now? Who are the big players working on cell-cultured meat?
So there are about a little more than 30 startups around the world that are working on this. The biggest ones, though, there are a couple in Silicon Valley. One is called Memphis Meats. Another is called Just. A couple in Israel that are like very advanced, Aleph Farms and Future Meat Technologies. And then another one is called Mosa Meat, and that's one of the oldest ones. And that's by a scientist named Mark Post, and that's over in the Netherlands. So that's where sort of probably and all of these companies that I've just mentioned are ones that are currently building out or already have sort of pilot production facilities that are just getting up and running, which is really going to allow them to sort of make more meat at scale than they ever have before, which will really start to signal to regulators that, we are getting very close to this moment where this is ready to go out into the market in some form, probably in a restaurant first.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think a lot of people can see the upsides of cell-cultured meat, right? A lot of folks don't like the idea of how many animals are killed and how animals are treated during the time before they're killed for food. You've got pollution issues. Climate change is not really something I care about, but a lot of people do, and so this could be a factor in that as well. But one of the things that I've wondered about is, as a guy who pays a lot of attention to politics and economics, often you see people trying to use the power of government to prevent competition. Are you seeing that here with the traditional meat industries trying in any way to stop cell-cultured meat? And if so, are they having any success?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting topic, and it's, this is sort of something that's happened over and over again throughout U.S. history when it comes to these sort of big food fights. It happened when margarine came over from France and sort of challenged butter. It happens with the dairy industry feeling very threatened about plant-based sort of almond milk, cashew milks, oat milk, and it's started to happen a little bit with meat. There are several, some of the meat lobbying groups have gone to state houses around the country to try to get them to restrict how these products can name themselves. But the story's a little bit different with meat because you have massive companies like Cargill and Tyson who are sort of sprinkling investment into these areas. And so I think in some ways the meat system may be playing this a little bit smarter than, a lot of the sort of other sort of agricultural industries that came before them, because they clearly see that there's interest here. And one of the telling signs that there is interest is that, and I remember it was wild watching a former Tyson CEO talk to Fox Business, Tom Hayes. He actually said that, Tyson isn't even a meat company anymore. He described it as a protein company. because he basically pointed out there's interest among consumers for plant-based products, for conventional animal products, and he said maybe even in the future cell-cultured products. So I really think that, the meat system is taking a different tact at this, and, who knows? But they're definitely investing, so that's a signal that they're doing something different.
I do think in the long run, back when the United States was first the United States, a couple hundred years back, over 90% of our population was involved in farming. Now it's around 3%, and obviously we produce almost infinitely more food than we did when 95% were farmers. And I imagine that over time we're going to see a drift in this direction when it comes to meat. Once people can figure out how to do cell-cultured meat at scale and produce food that is not more expensive than it is currently, I think very, very large numbers of, ranchers are going to have to find new jobs. And I'm not expressing an opinion in favor or against that. I'm just saying history seems to work that way. What do you think?
I think if you want to look at U.S. history and, when in terms of talking about the shift in farming activity, the meat system is actually a really perfect example of that consolidation. You think about, let's go back to the COVID-19 example. Three or four plants closed down, and suddenly a mammoth percentage of the country's meat supply gets shut down. I ran the numbers in April for a story I was writing for Quartz, and with a few closures of meatpacking facilities, it decreased production of pork and beef by around 36% each. That is a lot of consolidation. It shows that a lot of the farming activity that used to take place in communities regionally has since disappeared, and it's been super centralized. To your point about whether or not ranchers will be put out of a job, I mean, neither of us have a crystal ball. If that happened, it would happen probably extremely gradually. But the fact of the matter is that there probably always will be an appetite out there for conventional animal meat.
Right.
And
it could almost become a luxury product over time.
Well, yeah, that's something that I've thought too, maybe a premium product.
So I've only got you for about 45 more seconds, and I want to sneak in one last question with you, Chase. I got a listener question here. He says, my understanding of cell-cultured meat is that it's 100% protein with no white fat. He said cuts of meats without white fat tend to have less flavor than cuts like ribeyes. Can you ask your guest to address this point?
Your listener is correct in that most of the flavor that we get does come from fat tissue, but your listener is incorrect in terms of this being just 100% sort of muscle tissue. There are companies out there that have made huge strides in growing fat. I know that like Mosa Meat in the Netherlands is really making huge leaps and bounds there, and definitely in Israel they're growing it. So the fat and muscle is both being grown.
Wow. It's a fascinating topic, and it's going to remain fascinating for some time. Chase Purdy's new book is Billion Dollar Burger Inside Big Tech's Race for the Future of Food. Thanks for doing all this research, and thanks for spending some time with us today, Chase.
Thanks so much for having me.
Wow. I like it. And I do think it's important to think about the difference between cell-cultured meat and plant-based product. And if you've got any thoughts about it, please feel free to email me at ross@khow.com or text me at 57739. I have seen your texts this morning. By the way, I do see them all. Let me just stick with this for a minute. This cell-cultured meat thing. This is, I'm trying to think of actually a not too bad analogy, because I actually think this is an important and interesting topic. So if I were to think of a metaphor here, I know this is going to seem weird. So in 1995, shortly after Bill Clinton had raised income tax rates, not by himself, but with Congress, and they actually raised the income tax rates retroactively to the beginning of the year, so that technically income tax rates went up even before Bill Clinton was president. right? You become president January 20th. Is that right? January 20th. And they made the income tax hike retroactive to the beginning of the year. I was pissed off. I didn't want to pay taxes to that guy. And again, I know I'm not paying taxes to the president, but you get my point. I just didn't feel like this is a government I wanted to be funding. So I left the United States of America and I moved to Holland. I moved to Amsterdam and I was trading there. Although even though I was living in Amsterdam, I was trading the German market, which at that time had already been fully or almost fully computerized. So I could live in a wonderful small city of Amsterdam and try to take money from the Germans, which as a Jew always did my heart good. And I did take some money from the Germans, which was nice. Anyway, the German market was already computerized. And so barely anything was computerized in the United States when it came to financial markets in the mid-90s. Certainly in the derivatives, right, in options and futures and all that, almost nothing was on a screen. Eventually, I moved back to the United States of America, where still almost nothing was on a screen. But I had started a trading firm with some partners, and I told my partners, you know what, I've seen the future. And basically, we are the equivalent of buggy whip makers, and it doesn't matter how good your buggy whip is. When the car comes along, you're out of business. Even if you make the world's best buggy whip, you're toast. And I told my partners, look, we need to get rid of mediocre traders. And we need to spend our time and our money on hiring computer programmers because I've seen the future. The future is electronics. It is going to put trading floors out of business. There will be a few floor traders left, maybe here and there, but not many. Everyone's going to be gone. And it turned out I was right. I couldn't convince my partners at the time, so I left the firm, and the firm ended up failing. I'm not saying I even could have saved it, but the firm ended up closing down about a year after I left. And I think we're going to see a similar thing with cell-cultured meat. The real key to this is, can they find a way to grow meat in laboratories that can scale up enough to provide the amount of food that human beings eat every single day? Until they can do that, cell-cultured meat will remain the more expensive product and not the mainstream thing, and ranchers will basically be fine. Once they can figure out how to make the tons and tons, millions of tons of meat in a lab that people need, then ranchers may be looking for different jobs. We'll be right back.
Now, Impact Traffic.